So just to pick up on his point, Fabian's point, what he was getting at, he referenced general equilibrium. Hey, this is the issue. We were, a few days ago, we were with Chris Hadfield watching, who's head of the CDL space stream, former commander of the International Space Station, and he was, we were watching the Starship launch. And he was explaining to some of the people there why Starship's so important. And he said, order of magnitude, the way you can think of this is it reduces the cost of taking payload up to low Earth orbit by a factor of 100. So then to make it sort of salient to everybody in the room, he said, let's say it costs $400 to fly from Toronto to Mexico. Imagine all of a sudden it costs $4, 1/100th. So if it costs $4 to fly to Mexico, the way our monkey brains work is we think to ourselves, oh, now I could go to Mexico for the weekend. But of course, there's all kinds of secondary and tertiary effects. So because everyone's now going to Mexico for the weekend, the cost of the hotels go up. And because of the cost of the hotels go up, now there's demand to build more hotels. And because there's more demand to build more hotels, they need more labor, construction labor. And because they need more construction labor, the wage rate goes up for people who work in construction. And because the wage rate goes up for people in construction, it becomes harder for people not in the hotel business to hire construction labor, and so on. All those effects. And the idea of general equilibrium is to imagine a shock, like let's say the AI shock, and then think through, okay, what are the effects of that shock, the first order effects, and then the responses to those, and the responses to the responses, and so on. So this is very hard. Economists struggle with this, and for those that want to hear how much struggle there is, my office is right across from one who works on these types of problems, and I hear the moans and groans, and you get to talk to Joshua Gans, who's sitting in the second row at lunch if you want to talk to him about how people work on general equilibrium problems. But the bottom line is we try very hard and do very poorly. And so even the most basic things, like for example, AI lands on planet Earth, is economic growth going to be slow or fast? And I just showed you the two leading economists in this category have very different views. Jobs. Is there going to be a jobs apocalypse? Or in fact, will there be more jobs? Some people make the argument for more jobs, and the reason for that is AIs are powerful tools. They empower people. People become far more productive and effective. The returns to labor go up. And so if people are more valuable because they can do more things with AI, we'll want more of them. No consensus on jobs. Inequality. Will AI concentrate wealth or distribute it? Of course, some people say concentrate because the capability of AIs is very concentrated in a small number of large firms, and the compute capacity and power requirements are so capital intensive. Others say no, it's going to democratize because people become much more capable. Especially lower skilled people will get upskilled disproportionately, and so in fact we could have less inequality. My point is, even on these most fundamental of questions, there's no consensus. Despite there being no consensus, policymakers are still rushing out and making, they have to. They see AI coming like a freight train, and so they are rushing out to make policy decisions in somewhat of a vacuum. There is another way. At least something else that we could add to the mix that arguably so far we have under-considered. Speculative fiction. What's the value of speculative fiction? Why would we start off a thing with the chief economist of Google? As far as I can tell, NVIDIA doesn't have an economics team of any sort of significant size, so this Google economics team, most powerful team in the world. And yet we are struggling with the most basic questions. But here's what speculative fiction is good at. Speculative fiction is good at imagining a general equilibrium. It doesn't mean it's the correct one, but they can imagine a technology shock, like advanced machine intelligence, and then create an internally consistent world. Now, the point here to remember as we're going into the second segment is that you don't need to think of this as the right world. In other words, that the writers are trying to predict the future. But in creating a future, they help us starting to think through the types of issues that would happen when you introduce something like this into a world where everything adjusts. Okay, so that's the muscle they have that economists don't have, is they create in high fidelity. Economists abstract away from all the details. Fiction writers do exactly the opposite. They fill in all the details, all the nuances in the story. So arguably, when we are, as a species, we're hit with a shock as powerful as the one we're being hit with right now, that this is a muscle that we haven't needed to flex, because the gap between what the technology was capable of and what we were doing with it has always been so small. Now that it's so big, the returns to imagination are high. So with that, please help me welcome from Boston, Massachusetts, author of All We See and Seem, Ken Liu. Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being so good-humored. I said, when you walk down, just so we get the musical effect, don't rush. And then somebody made a joke and said, oh, it's going to be one of those painful wedding processions. Appreciate your good humor.
Love it.
Okay, so we're going to just jump right in here. We're going to start with just a few excerpts from the story, and then talk about this world creation. The first one here is on labor. And so this short snippet describes a de-skilling. So people have been talking about, are we going to become reliant on these machines, and as a result, de-skill? And here is a passage where he's writing about software development and people writing code. Few contemporary programmers could create a functioning, non-trivial application without the help of code demons, bug genies, patch sprites, script pixies, and a whole fairyland of similar artificial intelligences. So, Ken, if you could just begin by telling us, as you're crafting this world, how you were thinking about machine intelligence and labor.
So, to preface this discussion, the way economists think about telling a story is almost the exact opposite of how fiction writers think about telling a story. And not that either approach is better or worse, but it explains why economists are better at certain things and fiction writers are better at other things. Economists generally assume that people know what it means to be happy, and then they deploy their rational faculties to maximize that happiness. Fiction writers take the opposite approach, which is that human beings fundamentally do not know how to be happy, and we fundamentally do not know what it means to live a meaningful life. In fact, the entire point of fiction is to explore how do we discover what it means to have a meaningful life. And it turns out that because fiction writers think from that perspective, we often ignore the sort of things that economists treat as extremely important. We don't think that those things are important because it turns out that human beings, in our view, do all sorts of things that are not economically rational because they are still in the process of trying to figure out how to be happy. So when we create a general equilibrium, we proceed with the assumption that the point here is to figure out a consistent set of causes and effects and ways of achieving happiness without thinking about the economic implications. Because to us, human beings will always figure out some way to rationalize their behavior in order to be happy once they figure out what that is. And oftentimes they behave in a way that does not make sense. And that's what makes us human. So in terms of something like this, labor and skill, it's actually very interesting how human beings derive meaning from labor, right? So labor, from an economics point of view, is just about productivity. But for a fiction writer, labor is a source of meaning, and that's what we think about. How does labor create meaning? It turns out that throughout history, we have often and repeatedly had instances where labor that once provided meaning became meaningless. So to give you a very concrete example, at one point, the very act of copying a book was a labor that provided a huge amount of meaning. Monks engaged in this, and scribes were professionals who engaged in this activity. To most of us, this copying a book is a punishment. This is the stereotypical schoolhouse punishment to copy lines. But at one point, this was the labor that actually created meaning. And you have to go back and see why that was. What was the context in which this labor was performed? What exactly were people doing? And I don't have time to go into it, but if you were to go into it, those of you who have some interest in medieval manuscript practice will know that these scribes were very much innovators of their time. The very act of copying books led to innovations such as punctuation, space between words, the idea of glossing Latin and Greek to follow vernacular grammar so that you could actually have positional grammar. The way medieval Latin evolved to be fundamentally different from classical Latin, and all sorts of other things, which were all part of the process of scribal practice. The printing press basically overnight destroyed that entire method of meaning creation. And after that point, the copying of books became a meaningless sort of labor, kind of just busy work. And I think that's what's happening with something like software engineering. The sort of coding that people used to do was at one point a very meaningful thing. It was a thing, it was a form of labor that created meaning. Code generators and AI have essentially removed the meaning from that act. And that is why you see a huge existential sort of threat over what it means to be a coder or a software engineer these days. It's not a purely economic issue. There is a sense of labor has become meaningless. Where do we find meaning in new forms of labor once machines are being able to take over?
And just wanted to remind people, I know there's a few book authors in this audience, but for those that aren't, the timelines. This book came out last year, which means that the manuscript went into the publisher a year before that. So everything that you're reading when you read this book was, extrapolating from what we knew in the world in 2024. And it's remarkable to remember how many things have entered into our lexicon in the last 2 years. So when he's writing these things, this was before all the recent surge in using AI tools for coding had really taken off and become the dominant commercial use of AI. And by the way, one of the things that why our first choice for this was when we wanted to pair science fiction with economics was Ken, because if you think of sort of the Venn diagram of humans on the planet, there's a small number who are very good writers that are great at creating internal worlds, so good science fiction writers and speculative fiction. And then there's people who deeply understand the technology. Most of them are computer scientists, and there's some others. There is a very, very small set that are the intersection, that both understand how it works under the hood and also can create these internally consistent worlds. And Ken is one of those unicorns. Okay, in the book, he introduces a concept of an eaglet. which is effectively a semi-replica of a person. And so Ken, maybe you can describe a little bit of what you were thinking here as you created this world.
So I was thinking about the ways in which technology over time has allowed us to amplify both our cognitive abilities and also our presence in the world, right? So when you're able to only express yourself via oral language, your presence is limited to actual live performances and what people can remember from those live performances. Once writing comes into play, now you can persist, you can influence people across time, you can multiply your presence in that way. And crucially, writing becomes a new form of intellectual property. And I think of intellectual property really not so much as property, but as a way of extending your presence and your consciousness. So again, the economist's view is this is a form of property, a form of wealth generation. But from the perspective of a storyteller, this is about extending your presence, extending your cognitive and consciousness, which I think is very much tied to what we human beings find meaningful and how we create meaning in our lives. And then you have the printing press, which multiplies that even more. And then you have electronic digital media, which multiplies that even more. And I think AI is yet another technology that allows the creation of new forms of IP, or, from my perspective, new ways of extending your presence and your consciousness. So an eaglet is essentially a small model of aspects of your personality, your skill, your who you end up being. So if you sort of see your own presence as a crafted thing, your ability, for example, if you're a DJ, your particular taste, your ability to respond to the crowd, your choice of this song versus that song based on what is happening. If you're a writer, this will be the very, very mechanical, almost, aspects of your style. The way you choose to prioritize this kind of construction over that, the way I almost never use the final coordinating conjunction in a series of nouns, the particular choice to prioritize one kind of construction versus another, vocabulary, etc. If you can sort of abstract all of these things into a model, then this thing can be monetized and sold, because it is a thing that allows other people to apply the style to what they wish to do. In fact, people obviously show a preference for this sort of thing in the way that a lot of people use AI to generate images in the style of a particular artist or whatever. They're essentially evoking the existence of an eaglet. Now, the one thing that is interesting about an eaglet that I want to sort of talk about is, I think, oftentimes, when we talk about models of this sort, we don't quite capture exactly how they work. And I'll tell you why. I think a lot of people have had this experience of having a bunch of their own writing put into one of these AI models and then have it generate something new in the style of your own writing. And if you're someone who cares a lot about your words and you read the result, it's pretty cringe. It's pretty bad, okay? And why is that, right? I've been thinking about this deeply. Why is it that when I go to visit a school or something, and students sometimes as an experiment will say, okay, so we put a bunch of your interviews into ChatGPT and we asked a bunch of questions to answer in your style, and here are the answers. What do you think? And almost always the answers are bad. They're not things I would ever say. And I realized over time why that is. It turns out that for everything that you actually put out there, there are 10 things you have decided not to say ahead of time, okay? So if you sort of imagine your own presence in the world, it's sort of an iceberg. The part that's published, that's out there, is sort of the tip, but there's a huge, vast body underneath that you never say or you have decided to say no to, right? So I think Steve Jobs was the one who said something like, an artist is someone who says yes to one thing and no to 100 things, right? All the stuff you said no to, all the stuff you've decided not to say, that's not captured by the model. So in my novel, one of the things that I sort of talk about is to create a proper eaglet, you have to capture not just the public performances, the publications, you have to actually capture all the no's, all the rejections, all the places where you've decided not to do something in order to actually do this correctly. And that requires certain changes in the way we develop the technology. But anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking about.
You can, if you want to say a few more sentences, because there's one AI in the story that is a more complete, that has more of the bottom of the iceberg. And if you can describe that one,
yes.
Why that one was so different.
Okay, so this is another really interesting thing, right? So for me, the most exciting aspect of AI is, again, not about economics per se. It's about extending your presence, your consciousness. And so the most exciting sort of AI to me is one that's almost inconceivable right now to build, right? Because today's AI is largely centralized, produced by a few large companies at enormous cost using enormous resources. But I don't believe that's going to be the case forever. So in my book, the only sort of AI that I'm actually super excited about is a personal AI that is entirely trained by the user on hardware that's owned and controlled by the user based on data that is chosen and, again, controlled by the user. Now, if you have that kind of sort of condition, then you can have your own model observe you 24/7. You can, in fact, have the model see all the places where you said, no, I don't want to say that, I'm not going to say that, instead I will say this. You can actually have a model that will truly observe you in a total observational sense so that it can get all the sorts of data that you would never share with a commercial provider. Now, to me, this sort of model, which provides no commercial benefit to other companies, it's really purely for yourself, is a kind of instantiation of the old Western philosophical ideal of know thyself, right? In this case, the model really is just a mirror of yourself. It's a way for you to examine who you are. It's a way for you to track who you are. It's a way for you to reflect on who you are, and ultimately to understand what makes you happy. To me, that's the ultimate expression of this kind of technology for your own benefit. It is a technology that is not aimed at increasing productivity for anyone. It is purely about you reflecting on yourself, knowing yourself, tracking yourself, and predicting who you are and who you can be. And to me, that's the most exciting part of AI. And it's somewhat interesting that in the book, this personal AI is almost the only instance of AI that is portrayed entirely positively.
Okay. This is a reference to something. Remember that the expression AI slop in 2024 was very scarce, but it becomes a central theme in the book, even though at that time there was very little discussion of it in the popular press. If you can talk a little bit here about, you arrived at this by extrapolating from history.
Right. So again, right, so what I was trying to think about is, again, it's not as if cheap copies of human cognitive, highly skilled human cognitive processes. That's not new. We have gone through multiple iterations historically of things that once required a great deal of human cognitive input became much cheaper and mass producible because machines took over. And so the question is, what happened to human creators after that point, once the things that once gave them meaning became meaningless, right? So one example would be visual art. So historically, right, it's very interesting to observe what happened to visual artists right around the time when the camera was invented. So photography was incredibly disruptive to the visual arts. in all sorts of ways that are poorly understood. And there's lots of books written on this, and even, more than a century later, we're still somewhat confused about exactly what happened. But broadly speaking, what happened was that this idea of copying nature, of depicting nature, of creating images that in some way can be judged as evoking nature accurately, became something that it turned from something that only very few people can do into something that anybody can do, right? Photographs basically took over the entire business of copying nature and producing photorealistic images. After that point, certain kinds of art just stopped being made. At one point, it was very important to hire artists to do things like create images of presidential inaugurations, of battlefields, important events. None of that exists after the invention of photography. Artists just don't do that anymore. In fact, visual art moved into abstraction, into impressionism, all kinds of ways of exercising human creativity in ways that did not go towards depicting nature in photorealistic ways. And then we became surrounded, in fact, by images, photographic images. We're just absolutely surrounded by them, to the point where we don't even realize how incredibly disruptive this is. Photo engraving also made images, reproductions of human-created drawings incredibly cheap and easy to make, such that, again, we live in a world of slop. I mean, the average person who lived before the invention of photography might see a few hundred, maybe a few thousand images in their entire life, right? And almost all the images would either be actually handmade or be done via the intervention of an engraver, another artist who had to hand translate a human image into something that could be somewhat mass-produced. But all of us grew up in a world in which we're surrounded by millions of images, mass-produced images, slop, essentially, taking very little human effort. We are surrounded by decorations done with almost no human input, and extremely little human creativity. And we seem to be okay. So that's why I think the whole idea of AI slop isn't all that scary to me. We have already survived a massive, massive change in our visual environment, and we have now lost appreciation for art. So I don't think AI slop will transform that in any fundamental way either.
Okay, let's, one of the key themes that comes up a lot with AI is it's making us less human. That AI is making us, is threatening our humanity. You've taken the opposite view, which is it's precisely because we're human that we've created AI.
So I think technology is not really separable from human nature. I mean, humans are defined by the way our entire sense of self is defined technologically, right? We are surrounded by the exuviations and instantiations of things that existed once only in our minds. I mean, think about things like the calendar or maps. We divide space and time into these pieces via mental constructs, and we invent machines to measure these things. These are technology. Our cognitive space is very much shaped by these human constructs. The very mode in which we engage in thinking, language, is itself a technology. Think about how much more powerful you are as a result of being able to write things down. The kind of math you can do in your head versus the kind of math you can do with a piece of paper and a pencil. It's just night and day. We have always used technology to amplify our cognitive abilities and to extend our consciousness. And so that's what makes AI actually interesting to me. Again, not just merely as a way to make ourselves more productive, but to fundamentally transform the way we think and the way we interact with other people. So this is kind of an important point for me. So I mentioned earlier how human beings don't necessarily know what makes us happy. That's not entirely true. We have, over time, come up with some general rules for what makes us happy. And they tend to include things like a deep sense of understanding of the world and a deep sense of being understood, a sense of creating beautiful things that have an impact on other people, and a sense of appreciating these beautiful things created by other people. It seems that a lot of the things that make us happy involve other minds. And so I argue that our consciousness over time has become intersubjective in a very deep way. What I mean by that is we don't just live inside our skulls. We literally instantiate some of our consciousness, or some parts of it anyway, in other people's heads, okay? What do I mean by that? If you think about what you're like when you're talking with a childhood friend, and you haven't seen them in a while, and you meet up and you start talking, you realize that you're now speaking in a different way, using patterns that you haven't used in a long time, memories that are coming back to you that you have not thought about for a long time. Now, sometimes this is very positive, like, you know, you're meeting someone you haven't met in a while, and you're feeling parts of yourself coming alive. And I would argue that parts of yourself actually literally lives in the other person's head. Sometimes it's negative. I mean, we go back to our family of origin, and sometimes we talk to our parents and we feel like we're back to being 12 years old again, and that is not very positive. So this sort of intersubjectivity is very important to the human experience. And the thing that I think a lot about is, how can AI or all of these cognitive technologies change or expand the way we experience and engage in consciousness and subjectivity? Because I think that's the part about AI that actually is exciting to people. Now, there's a huge amount of consumer backlash against AI, and I think largely it has to do with the sense that the things that used to give them meaning, the things that they used to do that give them meaning, is now made meaningless by this machine. But that's not all of it. If you actually look at what people do, you find that people are very excited, or they find it very fascinating to engage in certain kinds of chats with these bots. And I think the reason they find it exciting is because there's a sense of assimilated subjectivity in there. And in the process of interacting with these machines, you feel your own consciousness changing in certain ways. I think that's a part of AI that is not explored or underexplored, and it needs to be dealt with more seriously. In what way can this technology that evokes pseudo-subjectivities, in what ways can it become part of our intersubjectivity and expand our consciousness and our sense of self in ways that, until now, have not been possible?
Thank you, Ken. Last one. This is just to close off this segment. The purpose here of introducing science fiction into this conversation is not because we think this is a prediction of the future, but rather what you say in the bottom bit. If you can, Ken, I can't see from here. If you can just read out the last segment at the bottom.
But sci-fi writers do have something interesting and valuable to add in the mythological realm. Artists go into the collective unconscious, dream interesting visions, and bring them back. It's these mythological visions that ultimately persist.
Yeah, so if you can comment on this about, you make reference often to going to the collective unconscious and coming back, and bringing back with you and sharing in the context of any writer their stories. And maybe rather than referencing your work, you could reference Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because that one has been around for a while. The technology, the instantiation in that story is not relevant. It wasn't like a good forecast of the future, but the essence of the story very much was.
Right. So just to give some context to my idea of the collective unconscious, I think one of the interesting consequences of generative AI is that it's forcing us to acknowledge that there's a difference between intelligence and consciousness. And what we used to think of as sort of synonymous, the two things are basically the same. If someone is intelligent, then they are interesting and they're conscious. We're now sort of thinking maybe that's not necessarily true, right? If intelligence is defined as the ability to manipulate symbols or language in a very advanced way, then ChatGPT can do all of that. But we don't really think ChatGPT is conscious, at least most of us don't. And in fact, most people find the sort of things that used to be interesting as intelligence no longer interesting, like the ability to write poetry and the ability to solve difficult math problems. Just, we don't really find that interesting anymore because a machine that is not conscious can do all of these things. So intelligence and consciousness are separate. This is sort of to give you the background for what I think of as the collective unconscious. I think intelligence is really largely about symbol manipulation, the sort of stuff that we engage in on the surface, the sort of thing that we articulate, that we can sort of lay out in symbols. The unconscious is largely the stuff underneath, the stuff before that, the stuff we think of as underlying consciousness, the things that give us meaning, the kind of inchoate stuff under there, the dreams, the mythologies, the deep impulses, all that stuff that's there that says there's a sense of will, of agency, of desire, of needing to connect. That stuff that's not articulable, that's in the collective unconscious. And I think that's shared by all human beings. So what artists actually do is we go into the collective unconscious, and that's the place of dreams, of religion, of spirituality. And we see these things that are not nameable. They don't have names. There's no words for them. We come back, and then our job, if we're writers, is to use words to say what cannot be said in words. And if we are visual artists, it's to depict what is not depictable, right? So Mary Shelley was someone who did that. She went into the collective unconscious at a time when the idea of science, technology, and this modernity as we understand it is just coming into being. And then she saw something in there and came back, and then she wrote the story about Dr. Frankenstein and the creature. And the creature now lives in our collective unconscious like a god, right? I would say the creature is every bit as meaningful to us now as Apollo or Dionysus was to the ancient Greeks, or maybe to us even. There's no way in which we can engage in thinking about or discussion about technology without evoking the creature. The creature is always brought out at every instance. It shapes the way we think about technology, the way we think about innovation, the way we think about invention, the way we think about arrogance of those who would invent, and the arrogance of those who would reject inventions. It's just not separable from the way we reason, think about this stuff. In fact, if you go back and read Frankenstein again, it seems incredibly relevant to this current discussion about AI. Because if you remember, the way the creature acquired language was very interesting. The creature lived next door, essentially, to a family that was reading Paradise Lost. This is how you know Mary Shelley was a big nerd, because she thought that the best way to teach somebody language was Paradise Lost. I mean, I agree with her, but that is her. But basically, Paradise Lost was fed into the creature's mind, and the creature basically acquired language in the way that we train one of these models. And then you can sort of see how Mary Shelley argues that the usages in Paradise Lost ended up shaping the way the creature behaves. These are very similar to current debates about alignment, right? What do we feed our AI? Is Paradise Lost the best example to teach ethics to our AI? You might almost say. So I think it's incredibly interesting that for a book that's so old, it remains mythologically so relevant because she was trading in symbols and mythology, not in practical, rational prediction. That is precisely why her work has persisted. And I think artists who want their work to last will have to work in the same mode to really delve deep into the collective unconscious and drag that stuff out.
There are many possible futures. We'll get the one that we deserve. To help us dig into this, the final segment, it's people that are going to share with us why it's not necessarily all doom and gloom, the way that a lot of it's being portrayed right now in the popular press, that in fact, everything's gonna be all right. Siobhan, Suzanne, Sinead, and welcome back, Fabio.